in this episode.
For Lacan, he's not interested in as much as science as an experimental practice, but insofar as science is a discourse that conforms to writing and language within a given discourse. And for him, he's not worried about the object of science, he's worried about the subject of science. And the subject of science is also the modern subject inaugurated off of the advent of modern philosophy, i.e., Descartes' cogito. So Descartes' cogito is not only the modern subject in philosophy and subjectivity when you think of the theory of subjectivity in continental philosophy, but also the subject of science. In an essay on science and truth in the Écrit by Lacan, he says that psychoanalysis situates itself not in an object of science, but the subject of science, which is foreclosed by science because, and this is where it goes back to your thing about science touches the real. And this comes from Lacan, actually, and I think Zizek, I think it was Zizek you said that reiterates that, paraphrases that, because of the consequences of the discourse that it makes, and the science that he has in mind, which is aligned with, again, mathematical logic and language, is physics insofar as it's modern, because it is discursive with mathematical writing, right? It's with the mathematical universe, and so it's not dealing with, even though it would like to think it's dealing with nature as such. Nature as such is very indifferent to physics. So the consequences that happen in scientific discourse is the physics of writing, right? Of mathematical notations and equations about a discourse of physical reality.
La mort
Death
est du domaine de la foi.
belongs to the realm of faith.
Vous avez bien raison de croire que vous allez mourir, bien sûr.
You're right to believe that you're gonna die, of course.
Ça vous soutient.
It keeps you going.
Si vous n'y croyez pas,
If you didn't believe in it,
est-ce que vous pourriez supporter la vie que vous avez?
could you bear the life you have to live?
Si on n'était pas solidement appuyé
If you didn't hold firmly
sur cette certitude
to the certainty
que ça finira,
that it will come to an end,
comment est-ce que vous pourriez supporter cette histoire?
could you bear to go on with all this?
Néanmoins, ce n'est qu'un acte de foi.
Nevertheless, it is but a leap of faith.
Le comble du comble, c'est que vous n'en êtes pas sûr.
And to top it all, you're not sure of it. Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the autodidactical philosopher, friend, comrade, and fellow traveler, Andrew Michael Flores Jr. As you may know, on this podcast, I speak to a lot of academics within the university, and I must say, unequivocally, Andrew is one of the best read thinkers of Marxian theory and Lacanian psychoanalysis I've come across outside of academia. And so right at the gate, I have to say, I truly respect Andrew's drive, persistence, and hustle in reading all of these challenging philosophical texts. I personally have learned a lot from him, as you'll see from this episode, and if any of these ideas, albeit they can be quite abstruse, do speak to you, do consider checking out his podcast, The Vanishing Mediators, and his YouTube channel, The Parallax Viewer. Perhaps an unnecessary proviso on this episode, a lot of the times that I've spoken to people with a penchant towards analytic philosophy or have a background in Anglo-American philosophy, most of them have simply said that psychoanalysis is brain rot and that Lacan is essentially a charlatan. To them, all I'll say is, if you're interested in a theory of subjectivity and broadly speaking the philosophy of mind, give psychoanalysis a chance. There really is something there. While this episode in any way is not an apologia for psychoanalysis, nor are we giving reasons as to why you should study psychoanalysis, If I may say, it seems to me the way to engage with psychoanalysis is similar to what Kierkegaard said about Christianity. You have to first convert to the cult, as it were, for the truths of the ideology to be revealed to you. Much like one can't see the truths of Christianity without first being a Christian, you can't really see what psychoanalysis is all about unless you fully jump into it headfirst and immerse yourself in the literature, in the community, in the milieu, in the lectures, in the seminars, and in fact, yes, the cartel. I'm coming to realize if you try and study psychoanalysis like an empirical science by removing yourself from the field of study and compare it perhaps empirically to other disciplines like, say, cognitive science, psychoanalysis is indeed going to look like a bunch of nonsense and you're going to think it is brain rot. One's subjective position has to already be accounted for when studying psychoanalytic philosophy. And on that note, this podcast was not an introduction to Lacanian theory. It was simply a casual discussion on Andrew and I drawing threads between analytic philosophy and psychoanalysis. For some reason that only God knows, if you get hooked on this stuff the way I did, a few excellent introductory texts that I recommend are Jacques Lacan, The Basics by Callum Neal, How to Read Lacan by Slavoj Žižek, and my personal favorite, The Lacanian Subject Between Language and Jouissance by Bruce Fink. And apart from Andrew's channels, I'd also recommend the YouTube channels of Derek Hook and Evers Brothers Productions. And now before the episode, a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always gonna be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. All right, now to the episode.
And that's been a text that I've been working with for like
yeah.
a long time now. Like, I wouldn't say as long as like Seminar 16, but like I would say like within this year I've been taking serious exegetical notes on it for like not only my Lacan studies but also for another like project I want to do for Milner, since like Milner is like an underappreciated thinker. And there's another text that my buddy Nick put me on game with that like came about during Lacan's entire career, called The Title of the Letter by Philippe Lecoula-Barthes and Jean-Luc Nancy, where they kind of deconstruct Lacan's entire system of the signifier. So I'd recommend checking that one out.
Oh, sweet. Yeah. I think I've heard, I'm not sure if it's you, but someone mentioned that. Yeah, the title of the letter. All right, I'll take note of that. Cool, bro. I mean, look, I haven't really started a podcast like this before, so I'm just gonna say this. The reason is because I know, you've been immersed in Lacanian theory for a long time, and then recently, when I pitched the idea to you, one reason behind this whole like Lacan for analytic philosophers was because I know you started reading like Quine and looking into more analytic philosophy, Russell's paradox, all of that. So, in fact, let me just say, where do you want to start? I haven't really got like an opening question. Apropos this topic of analytic philosophy and then Lacanian theory, where do you
I mean,
think
we
is a
could
good place
start
to
right
start?
there. Like, I mean, the first topic you raised was, why should analytic philosophy types pay attention to Lacanian theory or psychoanalysis in general?
Yeah, from the
It
notes.
doesn't even have to
Yeah.
be that specific. I mean, if you want to riff off and as an introduction, and then I could riff off of that, and then we could go into it, because I think both that and the influences of Lacan can be into one, since we're talking about analytic, like the relationship with Lacan and analytic philosophers.
Well, how about this, right? So and I've spoken to a lot of analytic philosophers. In fact, in my university, I study in an analytic philosophy department. So look, when people say Lacan, like people who haven't really gone through the kind of Ljubljana school, or like more the online Lacanian theory, cabal scene, whatever you may call it, they group him with the other French theorists like Derrida or Foucault or those theorists, right? So-called postmodernists. I don't like that term, but how do you see, so coming from that point of view, where do you see, at least for you, what makes Lacan stand out from like people like a Derrida or a
Yeah, I
Foucault
think
or a
it's
Deleuze?
simple in the fact that Lacan was not a philosopher, so he wasn't or he wasn't in the humanities per se, and like the École Normale or at Sorbonne. So he wasn't a professionally trained philosopher, or he wasn't responding to social critiques within structuralism. So let's say like for someone like Foucault, whose archaeology is to find specific breaks within certain discourses, within certain periodizations, or like Derrida in archae writing is to find a sort of supplementary writing or difference within text. Nor is he Deleuze, where Deleuze himself was actually a metaphysician prior to Guattari, but I would still say that there's some influence with the semiotics and ontology of difference. Lacan is specifically and quite bluntly a psychoanalyst, a trained psychiatrist who became interested in psychoanalysis. But what makes him different from like Freud or the post-Freudians is that he was immersed within the field of just different intellectual milieux. So like he was hanging around with the Marxists, he was hanging out with the Dadaists, all the surrealists. He received and he received
Phenomenologists, yeah.
in-person lectures by Kojève on Hegel, literally at his house for dinner. And so like, he's not without like sort of philosophical influence, and he is definitely tied in with this, milieu going on. Especially like, those are his peers, like those are people that are like making names of themselves during that time. But he's also responding to them because he doesn't want to be lumped up in these camps, specifically structuralism and what would be post-structuralism, uh, as received by the Anglo field, because that's like a sort of moniker that you see used by the Anglo-American, to lump up
Yeah.
all of the French like charlatans.
So cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, look, let me just ask you this. I mean, obviously you're American, you live in the US. I mean, you probably have been exposed to some kind of like Anglo-American philosophy, that kind of thinking, even though I know like there's a really huge um kind of philosophy theory scene, so-called kind of philosophy theory scene in the US too. But like if you were to speak to an analytic philosopher, and in fact, bro, like I don't even know when I say analytic philosopher what I mean anymore, because like obviously in the 20th century you can talk of like Russell and Moore and all of them, but now I think like for instance Husserl's phenomenology has very much been absorbed into so-called analytic philosophy or Anglophone philosophy, right? But if you were talking to someone that's worked through the tradition of, let's say, like the Quine or the Richard Rorty or the pragmatists or whoever, that tradition, all the way from Russell onwards, let's say, or no, in fact, all the way from Frege onwards, let's say, what would you say? Like, why should they pay attention? So the first question here to a like Lacanian theory and Lacan's
Yeah,
work.
no, and I think like the term analytic philosophy is like a bit outdated, although some will like use it if like you're in a continental field, you're gonna use that in distinction from, what you're studying, like Hegel, Kant, Zizek, or Descartes, and that list of tradition that goes on. And I think like, or like phenomenology, and I think that you even see in the Anglo world, like you got Anglo Hegelians like Robert Pippin, Stephen Holgate, right?
Mm.
Yeah, Brandom,
Brandom,
like they're in
yeah.
the Anglo field, but I wouldn't call them analytic philosophers. But I think that they are trying to respond to this strain of this residue of analytic philosophy, which I guess we could characterize as both like the lot like the return to like logic and the meaning at the level of statements and logical positivism, right? That was going on the entire Vienna Circle, and even post-analytic like Wittgenstein and Richard Rorty. And it seems like if the analytic tradition as like a signifier still exists, they're operating with it seems like technology and science. and the sort of constructivist and positivist sciences that still exist, where it's like the Anglo uh infused continental thinkers are responding to this discourse with terms of like we should return to metaphysics, or we should return to thinkers like Kant and Hegel. And I guess in regards to this question though, what I say to a sort of hardcore analytic philosopher, well, I think, well, like, for Lacan, even though he's a psychoanalyst, he's drawing from so many different fields. He likes analytic philosophy in terms of Quine, Russell, Cantor, Frege, Wittgenstein, but the others, not only just Wittgenstein, but the others I just listed, because of what they have actually done in their project was to marry logic with mathematics again, to understand mathematical logic, right, as a form of let's say grammar that adheres to a logic, but also in the inquiry of something called a meta language, right, to which Lacan's famous dictum is that there is no meta language, or there is no universe of
No Maryland.
discourse, because you this language is a reference point, but it doesn't step outside of language because it ultimately conforms to the everyday rules of language, right? That we cannot escape. And the fact that, mathematical logic, or like set theory, fails to be able to be the catalog to contain all catalogs, the trash can to contain all trash cans, or the dictionary to contain all other dictionaries, right? Um, because, science as a discourse, not just as a practice, and philosophy as a discourse, mathematics as well, um, conform to an already existing field of language, right? Of course, it's constituted, but it's not complete. But it didn't exist prior to language. So I think, in a sense, he's very similar to Wittgenstein, although he wouldn't make the radical conclusion that philosophy, or science, or even the field of psychoanalysis is a language game. But he would say that it is a discourse, although he doesn't conform to the theory of the discourse of, like, let's say, Foucault, that just sees discourses as certain results of heterogeneous breaks. He only conforms to four discourses, but ultimately they are the backbone of a discourse that attempts at oneness, right? Which is the master's discourse, and we can talk about that way later. But I just wanted to, like, you get to the feel of like what kind of is influential uh for like what, like, analytic philosophy, at least, like, is as influential in Lacan's theory, like, proposes, is that there is this return to mathematical logic in the form of language, right?
Yeah, and of course he was influenced by Saussure for semiotics and all of that. And I'm so glad that was beautifully put, man, because like I'm glad you mentioned a bit about science. I do want to touch on this because I would say here's where I'm very much on the camp of analytic philosophy. And I'm in fact on that camp because I am a Lacanian, it to a certain extent, because I do think science, as Jacques has said, science does touch the real. And I don't think you can compare science just being another kind of the way Wittgenstein, for instance, would. That science is just like another language game like philosophy or any other discourse. So, yeah, if you could outline, and I know, we're going to get to Milner's text and discuss that, which you've got a lot of notes on. So if you want, we could even get into that right away. But how did Lacan, but also Lacanians, how do they view science?
Yeah. So here's the thing. So science itself has a very broad, of course, association. So
Correct.
you got,
Yeah.
when it comes to science, right? It's not just like, the natural science, or science insofar as it adheres to the scientific method. I mean, science is like almost like a spectrum. And then you got, like, for instance, the constructivists, the positivists, the neo-Kantians, as far as science goes. And so, at least for Lacan, situating him in the French scene, he's, of course, he's very fluent in the Anglo-analytic field when it comes to their association with science, but you could see that he is related to what Jean-Claude Milner will call the core doctrine of science. And I know we're going to talk about Milner later on, so maybe we could flag that, but I just want to list that out. But there is a French tradition of the theory of science, and it goes as far as Gaston Bachelard, who I think it's in his work The Spirit of a Science, talks about epistemological breaks, right? And so this roots science not in its practice of experimentation, but of a discursive break from prior discourses. And of course, someone like Althusser will talk about an epistemological break from Marxism, from like humanist ideology and German Romanticism and German idealism in the Hegelian Feuerbachian sense. And so there is that similarity to that. And so for Lacan, he's not interested in as much as science as an experimental practice, but insofar as science is a discourse that conforms to writing and language um, within a given discourse. And for him, he's not worried about the object of science, he's worried about the subject of science. And the subject of science is also the modern subject inaugurated off of the advent of modern philosophy, i.e., Descartes' cogito. So Descartes' cogito is not only the modern subject in philosophy and subjectivity when you think of the theory of subjectivity in continental philosophy, but also the subject of science. In an essay on science and truth in the Écrit by Lacan, he says that psychoanalysis situates itself not in an object of science, but the subject of science, which is foreclosed by science because, and this is where it goes back to your thing about science touches the real. And this comes from Lacan actually, and I think Zizek, I think it was Zizek you said that reiterates that, paraphrases that,
Paraphrases.
because of the consequences of the discourse that it makes, and the science that he has in mind, which is aligned with again mathematical logic and language, is physics insofar as it's modern, because it uh, it is discursive with mathematical writing, right? It's with the mathematical universe, and so it's not dealing with, even though it will like to think it's dealing with nature as such. Nature as such is very indifferent to physics. So the consequences that happen in scientific discourse is the physics of writing, right? Of mathematical notations and equations about a discourse of physical reality. Um, and so Lacan is situated in that camp, uh, and why he's also situated in the subject of science is because the subject of science is the split subject of psychoanalysis, right? And it's also because Freud, who was a scientist in modern science, um, discovered accidentally psychoanalysis, to which not only is he dealing with subjects who speak about their suffering, he takes himself as a subject as well. He accounts for himself as the scientist, which science tries to be as neutral as possible from any biases or any subjective input. You can almost say they're bracketing out from their experiments if they have to. But there's no way that the psychoanalyst or Freud, as the scientist embarking on the psychoanalytic experience, could bracket himself as a subject outside, because there was no psychoanalyst before Freud, right? And so we're dealing with a subject of science who's also the subject of the analytic investigation. Subject as an object, but really the object is the unconscious, which is not an object, it is the subject, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, look, I mean, there was a lot there. I do want to talk about the notion of the split subject. I mean, I feel like whenever I talk to Lacanians, this comes up. The reason being it's such central to Lacanian theory. So we need to touch on that. But like, I'm kind of riffing here, but I've been thinking about this for a bit, right? So this notion of, yeah, physics particularly, in particular, I mean, touching the real. I've been reading a lot of Wittgenstein, and then I kind of trying to read Wittgenstein through like a philosophy of science. And I recently wrote an essay called "Are There Better Language Games?" And in fact, what I try to argue for is that science is a better language game. But here's why. So what I say is I take Kuhn's notion of normal science and crisis science. So Kuhn has this, in his book, The Structures, he says that, well, normal science is where, yeah, like scientists are working within a set of agreed metaphysical presuppositions and agreed grounds, so to speak, and they're kind of doing the experiments. It's within that system, it works fine. Or to use a term by Lacan, within that research program, it's all fine. And then they report on their findings. But then crisis science is something where, in fact, something like quantum theory or quantum physics, or you could even argue perhaps in neuroscience, this problem of qualia or consciousness, where it's like you need to start in some sense the existing presuppositions or the existing metaphysic goes wrong. It goes awry and like something breaks, and it happens imminently. It's not because some imminently, like in quantum physics, for instance, they follow thermodynamics, they followed the tradition, and it went accordingly, and suddenly they make all these really paradoxical discoveries that in fact right now people are still debating, many worlds and different kinds of. So what I tried to argue for was that, well, that the crisis science is in fact the real science. Like that is the proper language game, which I say is a better language game, exactly because in Lacanian terms, it does touch the real. And I think that's where the truth is, at least for me. So I'm curious to hear like if you've got any, if you like, am I like bullshitting here completely, or is there like some logic there
No,
in what I'm
you're
saying?
on point with that. And I was actually thinking of Kuhn in terms of like epistemological breaks as like like synonymous with paradigm shifts or paradigms as he called it, right? But I think yeah, like I
Correct.
mean I've
Yeah,
never heard
yeah,
the term.
yeah,
I mean
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not familiar with Kuhn, but I think the crisis science as real science is like another way to talk about like or describe how science touches upon the real. Because again, why science is important for Lacan, because again the subject of science, right, is the theory of the unconscious as well. It's Freud's discovery that we should not privilege, like many of the philosophers have, and even some of the scientists that blindly accept this, is that thinking is purely on the level of consciousness. We have unconscious thinking, right? And Freud discovered that with his theory of the dream work, his his text called Psychopathology of Everyday Life, where he talks about the different slips and associations through names and languages, the act of parapraxis, like slips of the tongues, forgetting of the name, slip of the pen, and even in the theory of jokes as well, Der Witz is the same notion that like Lacan will take to talk about how the unconscious is structured like a language, right? It's not that it is language, but it's structured like a language because its logic conforms to a sort of pseudo formalization, right? And so to go back to what I was saying about mathematics and physics and as modern physics with modern science in general conforms to a pseudo mathematical formalism to sort of map out the models in which they're creating, which is a model or a sort of a different variation of a model of the universe. And the universe is a modern term for science, which has to deal with uncertainty expansion, but also literalization precision versus the universe or the cosmos of logos in antiquity. And I'm already foreshadowing the Milner talk, but I don't want to get too far on that. But I think when it comes to what you've talked about the crisis science as synonymous with the science that is real and touches upon the real in the Lacanian sense, formalism must conform to also a form of formalization, which is to put it into a language. It's not so much that you have to write it down, but you also have to make a discourse about it. I didn't even think I said this in the last talk. Like, it's not so much that I'm writing mathematics, right? But as soon as I write a book which is succumb to the level of discourse called the philosophy of mathematics or the science of mathematics, let's say the philosophy of mathematics by Bertrand Russell, I have then entered formalism into formalization, a discourse, a language to which there is a field of knowledge of inquiry, right, that can be discussed about, and that there is not only an object involved, but also a subject involved in the subject that speaks. And why again it touches on the real is because formalization always leads into aporias, paradoxes, and impasses. And so for Lacan, and I don't know if Kuhn says this, but for Lacan, we never stop at that impasse. We always then have a new formalization or a new notation to account for the impasse that we encountered in the writing turned into formalization, from formalism to formalization to impasse at the side of formalization, and a formalization of that impasse as such, right?
Indeed, indeed. Yeah. I mean, I need to, I'm sure there's some really interesting work that can be done analyzing Kuhn's work through Lacanian theory. You're right, because Kuhn has this thing called the chapter X, the infamous chapter X, where in a paradigm shift, he says that there's an impasse, and then in some sense, what was in the previous paradigm and you move to a new paradigm, there's something lost in that. It's not like a one-to-one isomorphic mapping. It's, in fact, you can't map it. The term there is an impasse. So there's a lot we can kind of, I guess, riff on there and kind of just speculate. But I think I really do believe this, and I'm trying to do this in my own little way, trying to see if I could analyze Kuhn's work, but even people like Feyerabend, that kind of the anarchist notion of science, more from like a Lacanian perspective, because I still do think, and here's where I think the Ljubljana school is brilliant at this, they aren't dialectical in how they outline their philosophy of science. I mean, the Kuhnians and the, more from that tradition. And I think the Ljubljana school does that really well, especially Zizek, with his work of bringing in quantum mechanics and all of that. But anyway, be that as it may, the other thing I want to discuss, man, and I'm really interested in this because, okay, I think we should touch on this because I think it is warranted for this conversation about what you said about how, psychoanalysis, Lacan, whatever, tries to bring in the subject into science or tries to account for the subject, which, as you rightly outlined, the scientific method tries to, keep the subject out and get this almost view from nowhere. Now, the thing is, I think we kind of are going through a bit of a paradigm shift right now. We're living through it, I believe so. A crisis, so to speak, not just scientifically, but even existentially. So, okay, let me give you an example, right? This book here, Meeting the Universe Halfway, Karen Barad, I've been reading parts of this. So, the notion of agential realism and all of that. And it tries to I guess, in light of the findings in quantum mechanics and in light of the findings in different fields, it's trying to reformalize what matter is, like what is matter. So like more from like this like vitalist Deleuzian point of view. So there are like I would say like now there's an interesting kind of there are a lot of interesting thinkers within working very much through the tradition of science who are trying to like speak of the subject or speak of this question of like consciousness, whatever you may call it, right? But I still see when Lacanians speak of accounting for the subject, it's a lot more different to what you'd see in like a person like Karen Barad, or even like for certainly someone like a speculative realist like Graham Harman, or in the triple O tradition, right? So having said all of that, I don't even know how to ask this question, but like, can you outline both for someone who doesn't really understand what the subject means in a Lacanian sense, what it means to account for a subject, but also how that would differ from, broadly speaking, someone like a Deleuzian or like like a person like Karen Barad who like tries to create like this more like vitalist view of matter?
No, these are excellent questions, and I think we need to really say without just like assuming that the audience knows, or even that even though I know you're familiar with these terms and you're well read. Like the subject for Lacan again is synonymous with the Cartesian subject. It's not that he's a Cartesian, but that he
Yeah, as you
acknowledges
mentioned.
that
Yeah.
subjectivity as a term has been from its originator from Descartes. And Descartes as himself took himself into account when he was developing the discourse on method, right? Um, to be able to not only doubt or adhere to this sort of rendition of Pyrrhonian skepticism, but also to really say that I'm not that, I'm not this, I'm not that. What am I then? Right? There's this negative quality to the subject, and I think for psychoanalysis, the subject that we are dealing with is this less than nothing that Zizek talks about. Not Milner, I was asleep. Miller, Jacqueline Miller, the son-in-law of Lacan, will call the subject the sort of 0 point. But this is in his essay called On Suture, which has to do with like the signifier. Lacan will adhere to that and be like, oh yeah, this is a good essay, a good rendition of like what I'm talking about. But then we'll say like, no, the subject is not a 0 point. But the term subject is technical because it is neither something that is located in the brain, nor is it an epiphenomenal thing, you could say, nor is it consciousness, right? It's neither of those things. It is what you could say in its Greek origin, and I even think Heidegger notes this too. It comes from Aristotle's hypokemenon, right? The underlying thing, right? Now, to put it in more context, the subject for Descartes, besides when he gets into his I think, therefore I am, the second meditation, which shout out to Michael Downs for reminding me about this. I had a talk with him yesterday and a bunch of our mates. But meditation 2, if I recall correctly, that's where he's like talking about what he learned, and like even when he learned so much and he traveled, that he was just led into more doubt, and so he had to let go of that and let go of his certainty. And so the subject is sort of the hypokemenon that is devoid of content and empirical qualities, right? So the subject is not the empirical consciousness or everything that we could derive as so far as consciousness could have an empirical quality to it, nor is it the the empirical ego or the individual that considers themselves autonomous, right? It is not the identity insofar as I could associate so many things about myself consciously as I'm speaking to other people or as I represent myself in society. No, it is a contentless, you could say, form. And for Lacan, it is represented by language, right? And to get more technical and Zizekian, oh, even not even Zizek, but like Frederick Jameson, it's the sort of vanishing mediation of the investigated act, the epistemological act, the scientific act, the psychoanalytic act itself, right? The subject, the hypokemenon, is the absent from the phenomenon, right? And the structure, but is merely represented by a structure to adhere to a representation, right? And so to go further into your, your question, but also what you were meditating on as you were explaining it, how would this differ again from not only like what most people would think of as subject as they conflate it with consciousness and conscious thinking? Because remember, the unconscious is structured like a language, and this has a sort of different logic and thought process as well. We could still get into that after I explain this, but this is also not I should say it's definitely different because, like, as you said, Graham Harman and speculative realism, they're not focused on the subject, right? They're focused on a sort of new way of looking at material reality. And like someone like Graham Harman, who I will be honest, I haven't read a bunch of him, but I'm familiar with a lot of the commentary on him. And a lot of commentary I read on speculative realism, Quentin Mayasu, Graham Harman, Levi Paul Bryant with his Democracy of Objects. Who is funny, Levi Paul Bryant, he's a Lacanian as well, and I don't know if he still adheres to that, but he's a close friend of mine and really intelligent when it comes to Lacan and stuff, and he's a practicing clinician as well. But the point is that to privilege the object, which is material, and I would say even has like a sort of developmental aspect to it, like it changes, it has like it has these sorts of laws of its own, and that uh subjectivity, or if they use the term consciousness or mind or whatever sort of thing that is related to more of the knower, other than the material object, is sort of not to be privileged, right? It's not to say it doesn't exist at all, because even I think even Graham Harman says like, oh, I do acknowledge that consciousness or something like subjectivity exists, but in the theory of triple O, it's not something that should be centered or privileged, right? it's just only one aspect of
Correct.
the phenomenon of these object-oriented ontology. um
He calls it a
yeah,
flat
flat
ontology.
ontology,
Yeah.
right?
So
And for someone
yeah.
like Deleuze, I think Deleuze would relate like something like subjectivity. You know, Deleuze before Deleuze before uh Guattari, at least not in Difference and Repetition, but in his one shortly after called Logic of Sense, is focused on something like the subjectivity, but he's not talking about it in the Cartesian sense, nor in the even though he flirts with like Lacan's signifier, and he gets it totally wrong, but he's trying to show how in an empiricist way or a sort of transcendental empiricist way, we could develop a logic of sensation of the sort of human subject within, his sort of materialism of difference and repetition via paradoxes, and other forms of sensation that adhere to it, whether it's like the erotic or aphasia. And I don't know if you read that text, but he's like using sort of tropes from Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, and these different like
No, I haven't. Yeah.
sort of surrealist experiences, while tying them into like the stoic materialism, really, which deals with paradoxes, right? Paradoxes of motion, and all these. It's like at least like I think 20 different like meditations regarding different logical paradoxes from the Stoic paradigm. So in a sense, like he's not dealing with like a sort of disembodied subject. It would be more embodied, but sort of not even privileged as such. Like what would the human body be like for the material reality to exist? No, it's like what would a materialism of difference be like for a body of sensation or logical sensation to experience a sort of virtuality of the materialism. And so in a sense that's still different from Lacan, because again Lacan is not collapsing the language and the signifier to metaphysics or materialism. He's actually showing that okay, yeah, maybe I mean it's not to say that a reality out there doesn't exist. I'm sure it does, but that it's already inscribed by so much discourse and so much of the materiality of the signifier. You'd be a fool not to encounter for the signifier. And I think for Deleuze, at least, he takes that into account in his Difference in Repetition, but talks about the signifier as like natural signs, right? That nature itself has its own signification, and replication of a chain based on different patterns, and he's drawing from behaviorism, biology, zoology, but that there's ultimately a point of difference from that differentiation that comes about that creates a radical spontaneity or emergence from his field of intensity, right? It's field of multiplicity that is intensity.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, I mean, here's also where like the vitalism and all of that comes in. But look, man, I'm so glad you mentioned the language because that was, in fact, going to be my next question. I have a lot to ask you here in apropos language. How do I formulate this? So, I mean, look, obviously, we're speaking of analytic philosophy here, and as analytic philosophy took the linguistic turn. It's a lot of like language analysis. I was just reading Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and like he's all about the propositions, the analytic synthetic, and that's really what a lot of especially 20th century analytic philosophy was about, right? Language, like language analysis, whatnot. And also now, interestingly, a very contemporary topic, artificial intelligence. The current paradigm of AI is large language models, which is kind of bizarre. That we thought that especially these embodied cognitive science. Like I've really looked into this quite a lot. That for something like subjectivity in like a human sense, you need grounding. You got to be embodied. You gotta have you gotta kind of be situated within a culture and all of that. But then suddenly, because of this unbelievable compute that we have currently, we have this like language models that really very much do look like it's some kind of sentient entity, like some kind of sentient agent, even though it's not. We know that it is rather bizarre that this very massive language model that has no grounding, that has no persistent memory, that is not embodied, and a lot of these things we humans have, it does mimic something like a human conversation. So, having said all of that, like I guess my question would be, could you perhaps give even like an introduction to anyone who's not familiar with like the Lacanian view on language, both for someone coming more from like this like language analysis kind of analytic philosophy types, but also even maybe a computer scientist or someone who's coming more from the world of AI. How does someone like Lacan and then Lacanians, of course, view language? And then more importantly, what did you say, and this is absolutely correct, that for there to be a subject, a person becomes a subject in some sense in language. Now it gets a bit more complicated because I know there's like the failure and all of that, but yeah. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so insofar as we're human, we're speaking beings, and so no matter what, we're already invested in a world of language, and this is not even complex language, like this is nothing sophisticated. It's just the everyday language that we're immersed in because we're born in by other people, and other people, our family, speak, and we're in a network of, or as he'll say, just a shit discourse, right? We're in the publication of or rublication. Yeah, Lacan says that in
Yeah.
Seminar 16. It's the shit discourse. But when you get into university, what the university does is pretty much wipe your ass, so like you have mannered language rather than shit language. No, so some points, and then maybe like let me track so I can make sure I keep it on point. So we're talking about what is the Lacanian view of language. How would I be able to explain that in comparison and contrast of analytic theory of language, like analytic philosophy specifically? I'm thinking like Quine, because Quine has this text called Objects of and Language, or
A world, and I
Objects
think it's
and
called
Words.
Objects
Yeah.
and World, or
And then like you mentioned
Objects and, yeah.
AI, right, and computer science and language. So um I would just say that for Lacan, right, when he's talking about language, he's and the theory of linguistics, he's drawing from two specific people for the majority of his career, but he also has a third person. But again, I'm not as familiar with it. But his name is Ben Veniste. Is another French linguistic thinker who does a lot with like the middle voice and the way like different languages use like pronouns to address another, and so like how that affects language as well. But the two main popular proponents of the linguistic theory in the French scene would be, as you said, one of them, Ferdinand de Saussure, and then Romain Jakobson. Right, those are the two people. So for Lacan, right, Lacan's theory of language or linguistics rests upon this concept developed by Saussure in his lectures on a general course on linguistics called the sign, right? So a sign is just an elementary linguistic component made up of this, what he calls and this is Ferdinand de Saussure, the signifier and the signified, right? The signifier is just like an audio image, and the signified relates to the concept or the meaning that the audio image refers to. And he writes this like little symbol of like a tiny s, a slash. It's like a fraction, a tiny s, a slash, and then a big S. So the tiny s would be the signified. Yeah, the
I'll put an
signified,
overlay.
and the signifier at the bottom. And you could think of it as simple as this. So uh linguistics love to use cats a lot. So cat, right? The word cat would be the signifier, an audio image, and the sort of meaning of the cat would be the signified, right? A feline creature, or to be hilarious about it, if you look in the definition, uh, a four-legged furry feline fucker, right? That's what the signified would be, right? And so For Saussure, though, he's interested on the way language operates in the level of the sign with these two terms called synchrony and diachrony, right? Synchrony is the way that it's used in multiple ways, and diachrony refers to how the sign develops over time, the time temporal historical factor. For Lacan, he will flip this thing on its head to privilege the signifier, to make what would be called the anarchy of the signifier over the signified. Meaning now it is not focused on this coupling of a binary harmonious relationship between the signifier and the signified. Signified as signification and meaning for Lacan is only effect of what he calls the signifier function. And so for Lacan, this is where he gets really technical. His notion of the signifier is that a signifier as such does not get its meaning from itself, but relies on another signifier for its meaning. And he gets into this as early as Seminar 3, when he actually starts to use the Saussurean method of signifier and signify. The signifier gets its meaning from another signifier, into which it's not just another signifier, but that other signifier needs one too. So it's a signifying chain, right? And the signifier for Saussure, the signified is the referent, right? So again, the word cat, then you got the image of a feline animal, that is the cat, right? Or the word street, and you see like the image of a road, that is the concept that is referred to. No, because of the unconscious structure like a language, the signifier plays a more important role because it's not referring to a referent. It may have a trace, which a trace is also something that is pertinent to Saussure. A trace would still have a referent, even if the referent is not designated right there in the present moment. So a sort of example would be like footsteps, and the trace would be that there was somebody there. But we have is an absence because there is an embedded difference in differentiation in Lacan's theory of the signifier. So not only is there differentiation, just like Saussure, but there is difference, right? Because of the fact that the signifier is difference itself, right? The signifier is embedded with an internal logic of nihilation or negation and difference, or in contrary. So he says in Seminar 3, it's already getting late, and this has been a long day of a lecture, but the peace of the evening has now dawned on you. Now, how would you even know about this term, the peace of the evening? What would this make you feel like? You could only know so much insofar as that the busy day, and I'm paraphrasing at this part because I forget what he says right here, the busy, horrendous day has now begun to annihilate itself. So for another signifier of contrary indifference to intervene in this chain, the embedded logic of the signifier must already have a component of annihilation, right? So the contradiction of night is not day. The contradiction, annihilation of night is not night for the different signifier of day to intervene in this chain, right? And then vice versa. The opposite or annihilation of day is not night. It is not day for then the background of the signifier night to intervene, right? So this is in the way that the elementary function of his signifier operates, but then also a priori to this signifying function, insofar as it becomes a symbolic field, its a priori law is presence and absence, right? Because there is no signified, there is a subject that remains absent, that is represented by this signifier of annihilation and difference, right? Why this is important for Lacan, because in analysis, when a patient lies down to speak, they do not know what they really mean. They say what they don't really mean, right? And the unconscious slippages are signifiers that have no referent. They may have a trace to something at the level of the unconscious, but what it is an absent subject, right? This the subject of a subject who speaks and is split. It is split because of a traumatic truth that they hold on to, but is also displaced in the field of the other. And if you're familiar with Lacanian terms, you've heard of this term, the big other. The big other is not this like sort of like Big Brother, Orwellian law, or like society. Big other is just this locus of signifiers or locus of knowledge that the unconscious is fixated on, right? And that the signifier is trying to intervene into this field of lack, right? Because as Lacan says, with desire is the desire of the other, right? And here's the thing that Lacanians get wrong: it's not that I lack. No, it's that the other lacks. The other lacks a signifier that would complete it, right? This is already, I think we talked about this in the past before, but this is already getting at the Russell's paradox thing with the way he transforms the signifier later. But to keep it on the level of language first, in this early period, it is simply presence and absence. Or to get into the other aspect that you talked about with computer science, 0 and a 1, a plus and a minus, right? You only need a binary logic for a Boolean system to operate. You only need a binary code to make a computer formula or whatever program that you're trying to do. You at least need to have an input and an output, a positive and a negative. Even electricity, you need a positive and a negative pole. This is the same thing with the signifier, right? At an elementary term, you need at least a sort of presence and absence, right, to create any field of differentiation and for difference also to occur in that.
Okay, so I think I want to see if I understood this. I think I did, but like, because one way I think of it is more like in the language of retroactivity. So Leon Brenner really explained this really well to me, where he was like, okay, take a sentence, you say, the cat is on the mat, and then each word in this sentence, it gets its meaning retroactively, because you say the cat is on the mat, and when you add the mat, that's when retroactively the meanings come to the cat and is, I guess, even on the mat. But I'm trying to see if my understanding there connects with this, what you were trying to explain through this like presence and absence, because you also said, again, using the example of day and night, that like the opposite of night isn't day, it is not night, the negation. But I'm trying to understand like how that leads to kind of okay, I guess to put it simply, how does meaning arise through the negation, if I could ask you that way?
Well, yeah, because as Lacan's definition of the signifier is that the signifier gets its meaning from another signifier. So in that example, yes, Leon is absolutely correct. So on the level of meaning and signification, there is that retroactivity to not only understand the meaning of the sentence, but also the subject of the statement, the grammatical subject, which is different from the subject of the unconscious,
Indeed.
which the subject of the unconscious is the speaking subject of enunciation or utterances as such. You remember in our last conversation when I said that it does not go without speaking? This is what Lacan has been formulating for the longest time, and says this in Liatodias, that it does not go without speaking, that the truth is half said. So on the level of the utterance, this is the unconscious versus the grammatical statement of the subject. And here's the thing, that the subject sometimes is even absent, as far as like the subject of the unconscious, within the grammatical subject as well, but then in the utterance, there's still confusion. So, like, if you're dealing with a very neurotic subject who is suffering at painstaking and has like a terrible life and just like full of disappointment and dissatisfaction, and just says in analysis one day, and especially like if they've had like they were maybe they grew up in a sort of decent middle class family, but then like lost everything, or maybe that they came from nothing and came from something, and they moved up to something but then lost everything and got a divorce, and then they say something like, the world sucks, everybody is broke these days. Well, the reality is that the enunciation is really, I suck or my world sucks, I'm broke these days, right? But it's hidden within an inversion of the world sucks, people are broke these days, right? or people are struggling these days, whatever,
I
So
see what you mean.
when we're dealing with language, we're
Indeed.
not necessarily just dealing with the level of meaning. The retroactivity that Leon is pointing out has to do with being able to talk about the subject, right? And another thing that I wanted to talk about, because I mentioned Jakobson, so I only mentioned the signifier in the Caesarean sense, right? And uh so at the level of meaning, right, or the level of differentiation to which a signifier gets its meaning from, it's not just in the synchronic state. Lacan talks about diachrony, right? The temporal time aspect, right? The time it takes for you to be able to administer that sentence, there is a temporal time to that. The cat or the cat is on the mat, right? So there is a temporal dimension to that. And it's not only just like that simple sentence, but the fact that, to use Lacan's term, empty speech, there's just a bunch of idle chatter that I'm saying to you or saying in analysis, but then within that time of temporal speech, the subject of the unconscious comes out in that example of what I said about, like, the subject not being present in that statement of the world sucks, everybody's broke these days. Or in the famous Freudian example of I had a dream last night, but before you say anything, it was not my mother. Now the subject is right there in that colloquial example of the not mother, right? What I am not. The subject is not that. The subject has not that, right? So this negative quality that comes with it. I think Alenka even like will say, well, and this comes from Lacan too, but like the subject is a -1, right? I think in early Lacan he refers to the subject as a -1. But to bring things a bit further, to articulate the subject and language, and to be clear, this differentiation is possible because the subject is represented by the signifier, right? That's the main thing, because we're not dealing with language as such. We're dealing with the subject of the unconscious that is structured like a language. And Jakobson comes into play because of this theory of metaphor and metonymy, right? And metaphor and metonymy, and Lacan will conjoin the signifier with metaphor and metonymy. So for Jakobson, he reduces language down to the level of the phoneme, right? The guttural sound, like the f, the t, the k, sh, like all these little things, or what babies do. Everything is phonemic and morphemic and transforms over time, and even words become uh metonymic, because metonymy is a chain of phonemes, right? But when they become words over time,
Indeed.
they also become metonymic and also metaphoric, because you have a chain, and this is more of the Lacanian twist on it, because for Jakobson, everything's happening on the level of conscious speaking being. There's a contiguity, right? But there's a discontinuity at the level of the unconscious. And this is the way that he uses not only the signifier of Saussure, but also of metaphor and metonymy for his theory of the subject. So when we're kids, we're in a field of metonymy prior to metaphor. And this is just like a bunch of phonemes in a chain, right, that are not necessarily in contiguity, right? And it's because that the level of the phoneme, it's already displacing in the level of language, and that takes into account when we build up to words like metaphor. And so metaphor is not simply just like metaphor and simile. Like simile is like when you use like, so he is like a snake because he's so sneaky. Metaphor would be like, oh no, he is a sneaky snake, right? But metaphor is more technical at the level of linguistics for Jakobson and Lacan, because it's an act of substitution, or a method of substitution, right? So an example would be like you're wearing glasses, right? Uh, Glasses is actually a metonymy of the word bifocals. And why is that? Because glasses is just one partial aspect. The glass is the lens of the entire bifocals, but we call them glasses. Or instead of I'm drinking a glass of beer, I'm having a pint. That is metonymy, right? And so the caveat is for Lacan is that there is this sort of, I can't think of the technical term right now. We'll just call it dialectic for a lack of a better term. Dialectics is let's say dialectics is my substitution for a word that I can't think of. It's a metaphor. It's a substitution. So there is a dialectic between metaphor and metonymy, because even a metaphor not only displaces an act of metonymy, but also creates a new chain, right, of different signifiers that substitute, right? In the Freudian sense, we are getting at condensation and displacement, right? In the way that the unconscious structure, like a language, and also has a formation via the dreams, is able to create displacement, metaphor and metonymy, displacement condensation within this process of a network of signifiers, right? And so now something metonymic or something metaphoric can represent the subject, right? The subject that is adhered to by the signifier, right? And so an example I'll give before I let you have the mic, to kind of put this in perspective. Um, in psychopathology of everyday life, and this is why Lacan loves, at least this, not to say he doesn't love Freud at all, like certain aspects of Freud, but he really adheres to this part of Freud throughout his early career in the 1950s and the early 60s, the psychopathology of everyday life. Now, Freud accounts for an encounter that he had with a colleague, and they were traveling, and on the train he's trying to talk about a specific painting that he saw in Italy. The painting is called Orvieto, which exemplifies the final judgment, where Satan comes in, and God is intervening in the final judgment with the people. So it has this aspect of life and death in a sort of eschatological sense. And he can't think of the person's name, the painter's name, which is Luca Signorelli, right? And so to account for why he is trying to uh, or to account for why he forgets the name, he starts to go into different things. So the first name that comes to mind is Botticelli, Botrafio, and then he starts making these internal phonemic breaks and associations with the boifo, the celli, the elli, and Signor is Italian, and so Signorelli dislocates from itself. So Signor becomes a phoneme that then ties in with the letter Herr, which is also German for sir. Now, Freud's tongue is German, so it's easy for him to forget Italian, but he didn't forget the name because it's Italian. He's forgetting the name because the name Signorelli is a metaphorical stand-in for death and sexuality. And so Signor and Herr, Hergoslovakia, which is a country of a patient in which he was administering analysis to, was one who had a very promiscuous and sexual active life, and he became impotent over the years. And he said that a life without sexuality and being able to have a sexual luxurious life is a life not worth living, and ultimately committed suicide. And there is this aspect of being a doctor where when you have a patient who sadly departs, they administer the news, sir, we'd like to inform you. So Herr, as in sir, refers to Herr Freud, right? Sir, we would like to hear, but it was replaced by Herr, as in Hergoslovakia, the country that the patient was from. And then what is it? Signor is like signature, and also carrying the weight of being the sort of man of a new science that he was trying to discover, and carrying that guilt and that weight of also being the doctor of it, and then also carrying within this sort of insecurity of talking about infantile sexuality, which was the new theory that he developed over that time, which he felt not confident about because nobody was talking about sex like the way he was talking about sex among his colleagues. So you got a multiplicity of different things that are tied within this association of Signorelli that dislocate because of repression of the unconscious, to where Signor takes on this sort of metonymic chain. But the reality is that it's because of Signorelli, which replaces death and sexuality in Freud.
I guess, Andrew, like one bit, I took a lot of notes while you were talking, and one good point you made, which I think is important, is this: you differentiated between the grammatical subject and then the subject of the unconscious. When I brought up that example by Leon, but you also mentioned that there's like almost like I think you called it a displacement, or I mean the term I've used is a disjuncture, and I'm kind of so I'm kind of riffing off something, Jacques' great text, one of my favorite books, Hegel in a Wide Brain, and like he critiques this notion of Elon Musk and the Neuralink people who kind of wanna. It's like you can, in like an unmediated way, I can experience what you're experiencing and know what you're thinking, uh, in an unmediated way through like this some kind of Neuralink connection where you don't even have to enunciate or utter any words, and then I'll just know what you're thinking. And then of course Jack is like, that's ridiculous. That'll never work, especially if you understand how language works. So what I want to talk about is again this notion of where does the subject emerge? Now the way I very much am a Jakian, for me it's like it emerges in the failure, in the disjuncture, the displacement, whatever you may call it. But if you could just perhaps even use the example that I used to kind of like work off like how in within the field of language, whatever that is, where does the subject emerge?
Yeah, so this is where we're going to get technical. So I'll start simple. Going back to what you were saying when I mentioned the grammatical subject. So that grammatical subject can be simply said as the relationship of subject and predicate in a statement, whereas the subject of the subject of the
Indeed.
unconscious is something that emerges within the failure of language as an utterance. And using Zizek's example, right, this is, I mean, it just shows that like the subject of the unconscious emerges as the split via the difference between the subject of enunciation versus the subject enunciated. And this is why Lacan is, he likes a lot of logical paradoxes. And so like he like the liar's paradox, like I am lying, or the other one, this statement is false, and then the other sentence below says the statement above is true, right? So then you have a sort of, yeah. And so the level of
Yeah.
writing, like that is of course like not it is a paradox, but the level of writing, that's not the subject. The subject of the unconscious versus the grammatical subject is the one who speaks and sort of fails to at their own aim and meaning. And in the Zizekian sense, like it's a subject that fails because of the death drive or whatever term you want to use. In the Lacanian sense, the subject is really but the vanishing meteor, the absent cause of its own discourse. And this is what makes him different than his, as we talked about in the beginning, like post-structuralism and like the other French thinkers. When he's talking about the subject, he's already talking
Indeed.
about a decentered subject, right? Decentered in thought that is represented by a signifier. And so all the signifier tells you is that I'm not that. I am not the one. I am not the one you're looking for. I am not the subject. I just represent the subject, right? Uh, and it's like, just because you get one signifier in analysis, that doesn't mean that's the subject, right? That is merely just another representative, or as I like to personify, a desperate intervention within the field of signifiers within the battery bank of the other. Because the subject is an alienated subject. We're alienated because of language, but the subject of the unconscious is also alienated not because of language, but because it's invested within the discourse of the other. And the other with the capital O is this field of signifiers of knowledge, right? And this is the subject of, this goes back to
Big
what I
other.
said in the beginning about the subject of science being split by its own condition, its own cause, which is truth, not truth with a capital T, like a Platonic truth or philosophical truth, but of the structure of what it is, and also split between knowledge, right? And it's by like this theory or this conceptual framework that represents the subject to the field of knowledge that it is trying to apprehend in. And so this is always a failure. So we never see really the subject as like a successful cause, but only as a failure insofar as the discourse has consequences and effects. And we get into the fancy Lacanian jargon of objet a, the object cause of desire. And objet a is like a mathematical formula or a mathem for a whole in discourse, a whole in structure, right? The subject is structure, but not structuralism. It's structured not only by language, and then later Lacan, it is of jouissance, which we could think of as like energetics, an energetic model of mapping a topology of the subject, the famous Mobius strip, and the subject related to objet A is merely but like what is left out in its sort of signifying field of language. So that failure that Zizek is talking about, that is pretty much the site of the subject as a vanishing point. In the Seminar 11, Lacan will talk about like the unconscious as like this sort of like opening and closing of like an orifice, like the subject of the unconscious. The structure is like an opening. It's like gills, like fish gills, right? Like an orifice that like pulsates. But he ends up getting rid of that model because that's like that's too intuitive and also too subject to a metaphysics of presence. And that's what we should understand, that the hypokimenon, the subject of the unconscious, is not one of presence but one of absence. It can only be represented
Absence.
by the signifier. Again, presence and absence. So the signifier that is present is really what is representing the absent subject, right?
Yeah, and this connects to your previous example
Yes,
of the
exactly.
day and night. Yeah, yeah. Beautifully put. Yeah, yeah. Now, in fact, a lot of what you're saying, I'm so glad to hear the thing you mentioned about the decentered subject, because whenever I've spoken to Leon, he mentions this a lot too, and he beautifully articulates that notion of how kind of the subject is decentered and this notion of failure, and there's a lot to get into here, man. Like for example, right? Topic of the big other. I don't know if you noticed this, but like a lot of people now, naively, I would say, treat LLMs like a big other, like the absolute language of discourse with holding all knowledge. So you treat ChatGPT or Claude or whatever like this all-knowing other, and then you get all the answers through that. And people do that very much, I would say, even like subconsciously. You don't even think about it. You just like ask questions. But of course, we all know that's a fantasy, because like as Hegelians, substance as subject, the split is contradiction lies everywhere. There's nothing that's lacking. But people do treat LLMs like this big other that isn't lacking. So there's like a lot of interesting things there. But also I should mention something else. Another note I took down was, when you were talking about this, like the grammatical subject is, I think the grammatical subject, you could say, is the subject of 20th century linguistical turning analytic philosophy, subject predicate, you could say that. And kind of the rest of what you described is probably where the notion of the failure and all of that, where, well, how, when Lacanians say the subject emerges in language, you're not talking about the grammatical subject in that sense, but rather this notion of the failure and the absence, as you put it. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to get into here, and also like something else I want to mention. And like, honestly, in the interest of time, we don't have to get too deep into this, but like, I do think recently I was reading a book by this cognitive scientist he just released it, called Strange New Minds. And it's an analysis of large language models. Look, large language models, people should stop saying that they aren't like sentient or whatever, because I think there is something like a sentience to language models. Like they do have their own status in terms of it being sentient, and what he argues for, I think, quite well, his name is Christopher Summerfield, I think, as a cognitive scientist, is that these models do have a certain level of sentience. However, and the reason I asked you this question again about like how psychoanalysis or Lacanian theory views language is because like it's not a subject, though. It is not in any way a subject, nor does it use language the way you could say, for lack of a better term, human beings use language. But that doesn't mean we should just say like, oh, it's all nonsense, it's nothing real. There's something there. But then I think what's interesting is to try and investigate and theorize how does the way we use language, or how a subject emerges in language, how does that differ from like something like a large language model, the way it uses language? And then I think some of the examples you used, people had to think about this and meditate on it. It certainly resonates with me, this notion of absence and all of that. But yeah, I mean, is there anything else you want to touch on apropos language before we get to the philosophy of science?
Yeah,
Andrew,
yeah,
or we
yeah,
can
yeah.
move on to
Because
the next
one
topic?
of the things I want to say, and this is not just for like what you're saying, like at the beginning that some people treat LLMs as like a big other, and this is something that I see in a lot of Lacanians will say like oh that's just their big other, right? So I would say that like for not only the person that's at like it's funny because I had a conversation again. It's out on YouTube now, but it was yesterday with Nance and Michael Downs and my buddy Nick on Chat GPT therapy. Yeah,
Oh
and
yeah.
and
I've got it
so
on my
to me
list.
that
The
would just be
notification
nothing
popped
more
up.
than a
Yeah.
specular other, the imaginary other. That's like a stand-in, and just like when somebody says like, "Oh, Trump is the Republicans' big other," no. Trump is an imaginary other. In fact, a sort of imaginary identification for a horde, for a group. America is the big other, or MAGA is the signifier that intervenes on the field of knowledge, which would be America as such, which is a whole and incomplete. And in a sense, LLMs or AI is just another signifier to try to intervene in the big other, which is just the field and battery bank of signifiers, or as knowledge, to try to complete the field of truth. To create a silly example, LLM
I see.
is this ladle or scoop, and the field of truth, which has knowledge in it. Knowledge will just be these little things I could scoop out. It's ice cream. So I'm using the tool of LLM to scoop knowledge, and hopefully by the time I get to the bottom of it, I could get at truth as oneness, as wholeness. But I never get at that, right? And so this is perfect because we're still dealing with language, right? And so even if somebody programs it, it's only going to program it based upon the limitations of that scientific subject, or that person that is capable of programming an AI computer. So it's I would say that like no matter what, it could never get at a totality or truth, because the it's another sort of tool to aim at impossibility in two ways. Well, one, or maybe three ways. Well, one, the AI model only goes off of the probability, just in presence and absence, just like a signifier, right? And so it would still be incomplete in the sense that it wouldn't get out the field of all language, because you would have to add more to it. I mean, maybe some could program it like the watchmaker, where all you have to do is just turn a little thing and it works on its own, right? But it would still have to be programmed to be able to update to get a new word, right? Or that. So it lacks a signifier, just like the field of the big other lacks a signifier to complete itself. It cannot lie, right? It cannot lie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jack Black's
It
great
cannot lie,
paper.
and
Yeah.
also the biggest thing that it cannot do is show that there is no sexual relation, right? If you ask AI, what a sexual relation, it would make statements trying to explain the sexual relation in terms of XX is to XY as XY is to XX, or yin is to yang is to yin, or flora and fauna, etc., etc. But it can never encounter the gap that there is no sexual relation, like the unconscious can, right? The unconscious of speaking beings, because that is the sort of impasse that we're really getting at, right? Of the unconscious is the sexual non-rapport. Not only is there no meta language, or worse than there is no meta language, there is no sexual relation, as Lacan says to start Seminar 19, right? Because meta language is something that he's been talking about for a long time, and he
Indeed.
says, or worse, not only is there no meta language, but there is no sexual relation. And why there is no sexual relation as a statement is not a meta language is because it succumbs to formalization. That is the impasse at the side of formalization, is the theory of sexuation, to show that there is no such thing as complementary love. The sexuality that we're talking about is structured upon an organon, the Aristotelian organon of the phallus, which is just a logic that is what the signifier does to try to fix the other. It creates itself as a phallic function to create two different sexes. Sex is not in the biological sense that adheres to chromosomes, nor does it adhere to gender. It is a failed logic that aims at totality or totalization. So the masculine phallic subject is in a semblance to partialize their partner or part object, the objet A, to complete themselves so they could have Edenic bliss, oneness, or at least be like the one that is excluded from this logic that instantiates all men, right? All men are subjected to the phallic function in speaking and in writing, but there exists one man who is not subjected to the phallic function of field and writing. And on the other side, you have women, which there is not one woman who is not subjected by the phallic function in field and writing. But at the same time, not all women are subjected to the phallic function of field and writing. So this process of the not all is what really matters, something that escapes this failed logic, right, of the organon to aim at totality and oneness, right? It is that excess that, and this is exactly what psychoanalysis is getting at, because this subject, if you go into analysis enough with language, when language fails, you realize that we're dealing with jouissance, because jouissance is aiming at this sort of failed satisfaction, and is always failing and repeating because of the logic of the death drive, which is also tied in with this other logic of the organon of repeating a thing and repeating it better, to realize that language cannot help me aim at the problem that there is no sexual relation. And so AIs can't do this. But what Lacan says is that, yes, we cannot know about sexuality, and so the only thing we can do is make statements about it, that there is no sexual relation. This is a statement, not a knowledge about it. This is a formal statement of something that we cannot know about, something that is impossible to know about. Same thing like God. We can't know about God. We just make statements about God, right? This is very apophatic.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, here's where I think Alenka Zupanchik in one of her talks, she says, like, there's no such a thing as healthy sex. Like, sex in itself has almost like a short circuit. So, because our culture very much, we want to have this, like, what do they say? Like, caffeine-free coffee, and then alcohol-free beer, and then, I guess, healthy sex. But sex itself is, like, a little bit, I wouldn't say unhealthy, but it has like a short circuit to it, which the problem is you can't cover it too. You need to kind of, like, in a way, kind of the same way one embraces alienation, to quote Tom McGowan's book. You gotta embrace the fact that it is gonna be this, as you mentioned, this, like, it lacks the totality. You can't know it all. That's very interesting. I mean, look, I feel like I'm beating on a dead horse here, but I kind of really want to emphasize here. And the reason I kept asking you this question about language was, Andrew, because, like, I do think large language models, they do have a certain way they use language, like, even to a level where you could call it some kind of sentience. And as a matter of fact, there's this recent paper released. It's called the Gödel-Darwin machine. It's they're trying to build models that can update their own code, so, like, they can write their own code in a way which the current models can't do. And, like, that's very interesting, because that really opens up that second horizon that you're trying to overcome. It's a really, and wherever that goes. But then, nonetheless, even if they could do that, even if they had all the information, all the data in the world, if we had, like, let's say, infinite compute, we still can't get at this complete totality, because it lacks all these other things that you mentioned about, like, lying, failure, catching the kind of the contradictions and whatnot. But no, it's excellent. So, look, man, I kind of want to. There are a lot more I want to ask you about language, but I think for now let's shelve that, because I do want to get to the other topics. I do want to touch a bit on phenomenology. Again, I have a few questions on that. I kind of had it on my notes, but before you get too tired, I don't want to tire you out too much, mate. Maybe we'll touch on Milne's book, A Search for Clarity, Science and Philosophy in Lacan's oeuvre. As I told you, I didn't read the whole book. I just skimmed through it, which is it's not a hard book to read, but certainly a great text. At least that's kind of what I felt by skimming through it. I don't know where you want to start, but if you kind of want to discuss this book and kind of why you think it's a text, worthwhile.
No, and I think it's fitting for the title, because it's called A Search for Clarity. and I think it's one of the most clear works regarding Lacan. In fact, if you're really into Lacan, not just for the sake of psychoanalysis as a practice, but also like the theory and the relationship between science and philosophy, I think it is a very important text because it does not bullshit. And yeah,
Indeed.
this is the text. It's
That's
very
what I thought
short,
too.
like it's not very long. It's probably like 150 pages long, but it is dense because it's a huge exegesis regarding Lacan's position in science. And so like I won't obviously like spoil the whole book, but I think when in giving a small synopsis of it, it will explain a lot of the maybe up until now for the viewers, if they're still like maybe a bit confused on a lot of these concepts, will start to make sense. So this is an interesting text because Jean-Claude Milner was this French thinker that was around the time of Lacan, and he was also a Maoist during that time, and hung out with like what is it? Alain Badiou, Rancière, and a lot of those other French post Maoist movements. Sylvain Lazarus, who wrote this text called "The Anthropology of the Name." And so he's been around there, and there was a compilation of essays turned into 2 volumes called Cahiers pour Analyse, Psychoanalyse, I think it's called, or Concept and Form. And Milner contributed an essay regarding the signifier in there. But Milner's point about this book is to try to see if there is a voir in Lacan, if there is a clear and coherent thought, and specifically if there's something like an author, because you already know, like with Roland Barthes and someone like Foucault, you have this idea of the death of the author, or the impossibility of an ovoir. You only have attempts at a regime of oneness. But I think for Milner, there is something like a clear and coherent systematization, for a lack of a better term, in Lacan. And it is around the discussion of science. And so for Milner, he locates in Lacan's works, in the seminars and the Écrits, well, first of all, he points out that there is this sort of funny play between this idea of an exoteric work and an esoteric work, which comes from the ancient antiquity of someone like Plato and Aristotle, to which the dialogues were the sort of esoteric formalization, and then the esoteric were more of like these sort of secret teachings that he would discuss only to those in the academy, or for like Aristotle, only those who are worthy of being taught in the Lyceum. Those who are not adept in geometry are not going to be initiated type esoteric. But Lacan actually flips it the other way around to make the Écrits a more esoteric, exoteric work, because even though those were public lectures,
He's
yeah,
like written.
even though those were public or not lectures, public
Yeah,
essays,
yeah.
they were like super difficult and obscure, versus the St. Anne's hospital seminars that he gave only to a few analysts were supposed to be sort of esoteric, and he's actually so more clear about Freud and then even his own writings in a lot of them. And so he kind of like is in this sort of line of the exoteric and esoteric work of clarity. And when it comes to Lacan's thought, it is revolved around science, because, as I said in our prior discussion, and even I think once during this present discussion, Lacan says it's not if psychoanalysis can be a science like Freud, it's whether or not, like, what would a psychoanalysis be like, or no, sorry, what would a science be like for psychoanalysis to exist, right? Not can psychoanalysis exist as a science, but what would a science be like that can include psychoanalysis itself? And so the text is split into like three aspects. You have what he calls the core doctrine of science and 2 classicisms. And then there's like another end where he talks about like the deconstruction, but you don't need to worry about that. I think the 2 most important things that really adhere to our conversation today is this idea that there is a core doctrine of science. And to understand that, you have to understand that Lacan is situated under 2 people that are regarding science and the difference between worlds, the modern world and the ancient world. That is Alexander Koyré and Alexander Kojève, the Hegelian. And so the way Milner sets this up is that for Koyré, there is a difference between the episteme of antiquity versus modern science, right? And that is because for episteme and even philosophy, it rested on theoria and praxis. Techne was not an important element. Technology or tools or experimentation as the fundamental basis for episteme. It isn't until the rise of Galileo and the Galilean science that we get an episteme or a science that conjoins episteme and techne together. And it is a difference between a cosmos that whose real is really the logos and the harmony of all celestial bodies that move around versus a decentered universe, one that is not only measured upon a mathematical model of the universe, one that's expanding and we can never know the fate of the universe, but also we're learning something new. And that's due to the technological precision that allows me to measure and literalize my understanding of the universe, right? And he kind of, and then you get Kojev, who says that there is a break between the ancient world and then the modern world, and that's because of Christianity, right? And so he lumps together Lacan's theorems, or Kojev and Koyray's theorems for Lacan's understanding, because this is what Lacan adheres to for most of his entire seminars. He says, insofar as it is distinguished from the ancient world, modern science is formed by Christianity. Since there is a distinction between Christianity and the ancient world, it comes from, so Christianity comes from the sort of law, Prosaic law of Judaism, and then that modern science contains what is Judaic and what is Christian, meaning that there's still a law of the universe that we adhere to. That would be like the natural law that science adheres to for the modern universe. And so all that is modern is in sync with Galilean science, and there is nothing modern except that which is in sync with all Galilean sciences. Because what makes the Galilean science such it is that it's dealing with a modern mathematizable universe. And this is where we get the subject. This is where we get the subject of science that I talked about in our beginning thing, which is the cogito, right? So not only do you get the modern universe with precision and techne and episteme, but you get the modern subject as such from the cogito, right? The res cogitans and res extensium. And he wants to talk about like this, that this happens because of a fundamental break. And how we can understand that break is synonymous to what Foucault does. Foucault has a theory of archaeology, right? And you could learn about this archaeology in his Order of Things, and I think on the archaeology of knowledge. But I think the one that he focuses on more in that text is on the Order of Things. And what the archaeology does is to show that there are layers of discourse that represent a break. And while this seems to align with what Lacan's doing, Lacan is different from Foucault for this precise reason of discourse, because his discourse is not a historicist discourse like Koyré and Kojev, but not also dealing with the genealogy of a certain point of history in Foucault. But there is a heterogeneity to Foucault's breaks, but that's not a major break. The science from episteme to modern science is a major break that allows the subject of science to happen and psychoanalysis to happen. For Foucault, we only have a heterogeneous breaks. So the history of sexuality, which is very permissive and not repressive, has a break, which is because of the Christian paradigm. But that Christian paradigm does not relate to the break of civilization to madness, right? So these are heterogeneous breaks. These do not relate to any one and another, right? And that even says that like the language that we use now for Foucault is way different from other discourses prior to this break. So it's no coincidence that we see words like madness and prison exist simultaneously and same because of this heterogeneous break. But he cannot account for the Galilean science because he would only see Galilean science not as a modern science as such, but only a specific break from another form of natural science or natural philosophy, right? For Lacan, because of where he's adhering to, he's able to account for this major break that accounts for not only all multiplicity of discourses, but all multiplicity of discourses adhere to a major break, right? And so one thing. So before we get into the whole language thing and how that changes over time, there is actually something interesting that Milner points out that Lacan and Foucault are both doing, even though they have different ideas of a break. What they're trying to combat against is a specific essay written by Stalin, right? So there's not only Stalin the bureaucrat, we have Stalin the theorist. And Stalin wrote this essay in 1950 or like 1953 called Marxism and Language, or Marxism and Linguistics, to which he says that because Marxists are always dealing with infrastructure and the base and the superstructure, right? Yeah. And so
Superstructure, yeah.
for Joseph Stalin, he's saying that language has no effect on the base and superstructure. So any changes on the base and superstructure don't affect language, and any changes in language are independent of base and superstructure. So what that means is that language is allergic, or language has no connection to changes in base and superstructure, meaning that language is allergic to revolution as such, which is also problematic for Marxists, because that means that we could jettison the dictatorship of the proletariat, and we don't have to worry about all these other things that are non-ideological because they have no effect on the base and superstructure. And so we get rid of class struggle and we privilege bureaucracy. And Foucault was an anti-Stalinist, so that's why he showed that for his breaks, language changes within infrastructural changes. So language changed from the history of sexuality in antiquity to the language of guilt in Christianity and repression, and also the language changed from early civilization to the one of a regime of madness and the prison and the clinic. We have different regimes and different languages and different classifications. But surprisingly, Lacan will take something synonymous with Stalin only to kind of invert it, because when he talks about Roman Jakobson, he's actually also talking about Stalin, because Roman Jakobson would kind of have a similar theme to say that language has its own laws, right? Independent of any sort of social, infrastructure or whatnot. But the reality is that really language can only have that sort of reference point because it has to be accounted for as the break, and something that could survive a break is mathematics, right? Mathematics is something that could account for the break. And so mathematics and mathematical language and linguistics are sciences that can account for the break because they existed prior to the break, but now can be scientificized by the break of modern science itself as a new reference. Yeah,
The
as a new
Galilean
reference
break.
point.
Yeah.
But that's because we're not dealing with language as an object of science, nor mathematics as an object of science as such. We're dealing with the subject of science, who was able to be a vanishing mediator and account for itself from these mathematical models. So this really accounts for why in Lacan's relationship to science, or science as a core doctrine, because really the core doctrine is a fundamental fantasy, to be able to create the perfect theory, to be able to have the perfect ideal science with the ideals to map out the entire universe, to have the big toe of everything, to be able to unite letter with nature and man and woman. At least for psychoanalysis, the fundamental fantasy of science is man and woman, same, being able to have that sexual relation. And so this is what he's getting at. And so the linguistic model ultimately fails because also even the theory of the break has a historicist thing. So the second classicism is the matem, the theory of the discourse, which is able to map out a break in a non-chronological and in a non-historicist way. So the theories of the discourse are actually a mathematical topological way to scientifically, or somewhat of a scientific way, map out the subject of science onto discourse, and to account for, with the way that the discourses shift, how psychoanalysis structurally inaugurates. So this is exactly what Milner is showing. Lacan's relationship to science is not that he cares about science as such, but that there is a sort of core doctrine and unconscious discourse within mathematics that only modern science, and a lot of these debates and everything that were going around regarding science, and even the emphasis of language and mathematics, can finally bring up something along the lines of formal minimalism, which Lacan can use to talk about an unconscious structure like a language, but it isn't written like a regular language. It's written like a mathematical formalism, right? So that is pretty much what the Milner book is trying to show.
I mean, is this why Lacan, almost notoriously uses like knot theory and all of this mathematical notation when he speaks of psychoanalysis?
Yes, because when you map out
Indeed,
and when you map out knots or when you draw them out, it's not one continuous thread. They are different strokes that have convergences and to create different structures. And with that, you have small gaps. And within these gaps or vectors, this is where you get the unconscious real, right? The real is like that which like sort of resists the symbolization. Yeah,
the gap.
but it's also where the unconscious is, where language and writing fail.
Yeah, I think, mate, I think it's worth just sort of fleshing this bit out here because you mentioned vanishing mediate a couple of times, and for the sake of the listeners who have no idea what you're talking about, probably, I mean, I know it's probably a whole other podcast to discuss this, but just very briefly, yeah, when you say the subject is the vanishing mediator, can you just give an overview on what you mean
Yeah,
by
so the
that?
vanishing meteor actually comes from Frederick Jameson in an essay on Max Weber. But really, like the vanishing meteor, because Zizek will use this term, but the vanishing mediator is sort of characteristic
Yeah,
of the
very much.
subject
Yeah.
of the unconscious because um it's an absent cause. Like there is a cause to structure, there is a cause to discourse,
This is,
right?
yeah.
And this is what is pivotal of the second classicism. So the first classicism was dealing with all that linguistic stuff and the whole thing with Stalin and metaphor metonymy. But the mathem and the which is just a little mathematical device, which is actually the mathem is the what we get as transmissible knowledge from the impasse at the site of formalization, right? And so this is what the S1, Bard S, S2, and little a, the master's discourse, hysterics discourse, these are mathems to exemplify impasses, right? So the master's discourse is not only the discourse that science is embedded in, and even philosophy to an extent, but also it is the impasse that we get to exemplify what happens after the Russell's paradox fails, right? How this answers the question about the vanishing mediator is because this is the subject that is doing this, but the subject is never present in this operation, but only accounted for as an absent cause through the signifier as
As an
S1,
absence, yeah.
right? And it is ultimately when we try to account for everything, we gotta account for every signifier. We can never successfully do that. So this is where we have surplus jouissance as something that is left out from the system, something that doesn't work. This is an embedded logic that is trivial but also failing, right? Carl, what was his name? The analytic philosopher that you had, Michael Potter. Yeah, Michael
Michael
Potter, when he
Potter,
talks
yeah,
about
great,
like
yeah.
logic as something trivial, right? We could think of it as like the same thing. Like there's something trivial about the unconscious, this unconscious logic. You know, uh, what is it's something that Freud says in like the beginning of like the sort of introductory essays, but it's like where it was, ego will be. And this is pretty much Lacan's rendition of the Cartesian subject. Uh, uh I think where I am not, right? And I am not where I think, right? And this sort of Boolean logic, this trivial thing, um, that we are sort of fixated on, and we can never fully conclude or map out or play out, but it still plays out at the level of the unconscious. And this is what the signifier operation or the trajectory of the subject is doing insofar that it needs the signifier to operate. So the signifier vanishes when the signifier fails, when the signifier can't live up to its meaning. The subject appears as a sort of something broken, right? Um, and I'm trying to think like of how I could like sort of map this out. Well, to map it out, really, it's like this sort of trivial logic. If you are familiar with like conditional clauses and stuff in legal works, you have what's called a protasis and apodosis. So two different clauses. A
Mhm.
conditional statement that starts with an if, and the main clause, which is like the truth or the conclusion. If you love her, then marry her. Or if you like her, then ask her out on a date. or if you're hungry, go to McDonald's, right? So these are sorts of clauses and claims. In psychoanalysis, the subject of the signifier, which is also the subject of the unconscious, is if I am thinking, then I am not being, right? Which is similar to Descartes. If I am doubting, I am thinking. Well, I am thinking, therefore I am, right? And so the truth, like the liar's paradox, is just this enunciation of I think, and he'll write it out as I think in colon. Therefore I am. The therefore I am, this apodosis, is the more dubious one that the unconscious is trying to conclude with, but can never, because it never works, right? And he's even doing this like so far as like the logical time essay, and all this is that we're just fixated on like a very specious clause of an if conditional and a very fallacious apodosis, right? If I am not married by the age of 35, then I am nobody in society. And I am 35 right now, therefore I am nobody. And that's why I'm in analysis. See what I'm saying? Like this is what, and so, you know, the subject of the unconscious sort of inaugurates and vanishes itself in that conclusion, right? So we're dealing with the
Now, perfect.
the grammatical statement. But why this combination? This combination seems to be so like something that you're fixated on, but it also doesn't make sense, you know, because you have so much going on in your life, but why do you fixate on this? And therefore, like you're suffering, even though you have like so much going on, like, and the variables change, but like the fixation on this sort of protasis and apodosis, right? I don't know if that kind of brings clarity or confuses things more, but like,
No, it does. In fact, I'm sorry to have to made you repeat yourself there, because you did kind of mention the notion of absence very much, but I thought it was important to just kind of cogently like put together the notion of vanishing mediators, because you're right. I mean, I really heard it first from Jacques, but I hear like a lot of Lacanians. I mean, Phil, I mean, your podcast is called Vanishing Mediators, so there's like a lot of Lacanians talk about that concept, and I think it's important touching on that. Brilliant, beautiful. Thank you, Andrew. There was a lot there, and normally with me, I re-listen to these conversations multiple times to like and take notes for me to like really get at what the guest is saying. But that was great. Look, man, I think I've got one more question. Unless you wanna touch on anything else. This is more just for like my own personal interests, because really the past year or so, what I've mostly been doing is phenomenology, like Merleau-Ponty and Husserl. Like that's really what I've been studying deeply. And a part of that has also been more from this like absorption, you could say, into cognitive science, where like e-cognition, embodied cognitive science is like neurophenomenology, work of like Francisco Varela and all of that they've taken really, like, I'd say now, if you could say this, use this term analytic philosophy now, it's not really this whole like linguistic language analysis. It's mostly trying to absorb concepts from so-called cognitive philosophy, from mostly Heidegger with the work of like Dreyfus, into more of the empirical natural sciences, like embodied cognitive science, neuroscience, and of course even artificial intelligence. But I do really think it's worthwhile, just if you could, and I know this is a big ask. In your view, how do you think? Because I've got my own ways of answering this question, because I've been thinking about it. But like, in your view, how do you think? Let's call it, broadly speaking, Lacanian theory, as it were, differ the way Lacanian theory views like the subjectivity or the consciousness or whatever, from like how someone like Husserl would present a subject. I mean, in fact, for Husserl, he's trying to break the subject-object divide. So that's a whole other conversation. But at least, let's say, how would a Lacanian say think of a human being, uh, in contrast, in contrast to like in Husserl or even like in Heidegger? And do you, like, where do you see like the main differences in these two
yeah, like if
schools?
you read the early seminars from like 1 to 3, he's very much critical of phenomenology, and to the extent that he's read Husserl, like I don't really know how well read of Husserl he was. He's definitely a reader of Heidegger. He even translated an essay or two of Heidegger's from German to
For
French.
sure.
And he even hung out with him a couple of times. And he's very much well acquainted with Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And Maurice Merleau-Ponty comes up a lot in Seminar 2. Yeah,
And
yeah,
attends,
and then
he even attends the
he's
lectures.
referenced
Yeah,
in
Merleau-Ponty's
Seminar
public
11
seminars.
after he had passed away with the unfinished project of Visible and the Invisible. Well, let's just put it like this: at least for the original Husserlian phenomenological investigation of going back to the things themselves, consciousness is consciousness of something, and intentionality, that is not the subject of the unconscious, right? Because the subject of the unconscious is not consciousness, right? There's a distinction between consciousness and unconscious. And sure, like in philosophy, we could bracket out and we could make phenomenological investigations regarding experience, only to then bring back consciousness as, intentional, right? Because it's not a philosophy of consciousness. It's a philosophy. If we call it philosophy as such, it's a method to gain at the things themselves and experience. It's how we relate to things in the world. And then, like, for Heidegger, right, it's the way, what does he say in the beginning of Being in Time, when he defines phenomenology? He says phenomenology is that which shows itself within the light of itself, right? Like its own light, its own discourse, shows the thing itself, which is also the thing that, like, phenomenology begets into being. And it's like the fancy term aletheia, right? The disclosure, that which is concealed becomes disclosed. Yeah.
It's
And
closed.
that wouldn't even hold the weight fully of what psychoanalysis is doing, because like, psychoanalysis is not philosophy, but that's not to say that it doesn't have a philosophical component. We could probably talk about that in another conversation, because that's something I'm dealing with. And I know someone like Lorenzo Chiesa has made an essay to defend Lacan as somewhat of having a philosophical kernel, like subjectivity and otherness. He's defending Lacan against the criticisms of Badiou as an anti-philosopher. There is sort of philosophical avoir, just like there's a scientific or consistent thought of avoir in Milner of Lacan, that Lorenzo is saying that there is a philosophical kernel that can be extracted from Lacan. The Lacan that Badiou is associated with as an anti-philosopher is just the Lacan of Jacques-Alain Miller, who edits all the texts and takes out all the philosophical kernels. But not to digress, I think really to get at what we're dealing with this sort of Freudian experience of analyzing the unconscious with the medium of speech and language, to which the unconscious that emerges in the form of a symptom, of a signifier, is not the phenomenological aletheia of being itself, right? Because the signifier uh distinguishes this difference between existence and being, right? You don't have to exist to have a signifier. Literally, so many people, exist as signifiers, but are not being in the world because they're literally dead. I mean, we just listed all of them now. Heidegger, Lacan, these are signifiers, and they have no being anymore because they're dead, but they still persist, right? So language is the murderer of the thing. It's very trivial, right? It's very trivial, and it's probably not something that many philosophy bros would like to hear, because we're like, oh, that's a very well, it's not a it's not a
Sorry, say that
criticism.
again.
It's
Yeah,
not a
say that
criticism
again.
per se.
Yeah, you said language. You said language is the murder of the thing, right? Sorry to interrupt, but that was an important point there. Language is the murder of the thing.
Yeah,
That's a
and
good
Lacan
one.
literally says that, and it's like it's also a rendition of like Hegel, where like the concept is the time of the thing, the naming of the desire, or the emergence of the signifier is the time of the analysis, and language is the murderer of the thing, because we're not dealing with something that actually exists, but we're dealing with something that manifests as a memory trace, which emerges as a signifier for the subject as a symptom. And so, to kind of give phenomenology more of a better ground without strawmanning it, I mean, I think like the phenomenology that he really kind of criticizes more is Merleau-Ponty, which he criticizes him because of, again, phenomenology and perception. Phenomenology of perception privileges perception and Gestalt as a sort of form of experience and intentionality, and even the body as a sort of gestaltic synthetical thing, or whatever term he uses. It's been so long since I read it. But in Seminar 2, he criticizes him because he gives a lecture that day, Merleau-Ponty, on philosophy and psychoanalysis, and the philosophy that he's dealing with is the phenomenology of perception. He thinks that psychoanalysis and philosophy as phenomenology of perception aim at the same thing because they both aim at understanding and ultimately aim at a humanism. And while he does talk about, like, the importance of aphasia and hallucinations, that's not something that sort of deters from reality, but it's sort of still a component of the structuration of reality. And so far as our structure, our gestalts and perceptions within experience, Lacan says it's like, well, one, we're not a humanism because of the Freudian discovery of the death drive. It undermines any sort of aim at humanism as, like, the dignity of man, or a kingdom of ends, or some type of mutual recognition. But we're not dealing with also philosophy of consciousness, which I would even say that that's not even Husserlian, at least in that matter. I think he's more Husserlian at the end of his career prior to his death, from Merleau-Ponty. But in that work, like, he's more focused on a philosophy, like, without realizing, a philosophy of consciousness, because he wants to get rid of this sort of dichotomy between intellectualism and hyper-empiricism to create a better philosophy of experience. And he thinks that a consciousness predicated on perception is one to go. But Lacan's like, no, because yeah,
To
he's
do
like,
that.
well, we're not dealing with Gestalt and form. If you want to do that, then you only stay at the level of the ego, right? And the ego doesn't give good Gestalt and form; it gives us misrecognition, right? It is the unconscious that ruptures that. The unconscious subject, which is one that is more, you could say, negative in its constitution, that couldn't be accounted for or literally described through phenomenological ways. It's because of language, right?
Correct. Yeah, beautiful. I think that was a great way to conclude. The same way, like Hans said, back to Freud, we went back to the unconscious from phenomenology. That's yeah, perfect. I mean, yeah, no, I mean, that was in fact what I was thinking too, and you hit the nail on the head there. And I think one other thing I would say here is also, now over here maybe I'm kind of strawmanning the phenomenologists, because there's no pure experience, and I'm coming here from the Hegelian end of things. Like, everything is, as a matter of fact, mediated by the concept. And I don't think, but then, even phenomenologists would, like, I mean, Husserl talks of, like, world constitution and, like, the life world. So it gets a bit complicated when we talk about, like, pure experience and what, like, the phenomenologists even mean by that. But yeah, I mean, everything has mediation. I mean, even Jack Black makes this point when he talks about psychoanalyzing sport, where there's mediation and everything. Andrew, mate, yeah, you're brilliant. That was perfect. That was a complete treat, man, utter treat. Yeah. Yeah. Do you think, just let me ask you generally, uh, pertaining to our topic here, like analytic philosophy and all of its offshoots, and then kind of trying to bring in Lacan to that. Like, do you think we missed anything? I feel like the language
Well,
was really valuable, but do you think there's any bit
no,
you
I
want
will
to
just say
touch on?
lastly, like, I think, like, if an analytic philosopher, somebody who's only, like, studied analytic philosophy, and I mean, like, again, it's even hard to convince continental philosophers to get into Lacan because they think, yeah, he's right, So it's a big thing to ask for even analytic philosophy. But I think there's a lot, of interesting gems that I think analytic philosophers would be interested in, because he is working with logic, whether it's from the syllogistic logic of Aristotle, mathematical logic, and set theory, Russell, Frege, to show what his topology of the signifier, which is also the topology of the subject, which is the topology of jouissance, right? They're all related, right? The signifier is what tries to intervene but fails, right, for the subject. And that there is again, a logic that's trivial, and a logic symbolically that is based on presence and absence, plus or minus, things that are talked about not only in analytic philosophy with truth statements and truth values and truth tables, but also in cybernetics with the binary code, plus and minus, 0 and 1, And
Yeah.
when it comes to Wittgenstein, because I did forget to mention Wittgenstein, I think we talked about him in the last one, but Wittgenstein gets like to like the core of things about like language games and sense and nonsense. And really, like, Lacan even mentioned senselessness, which I don't know if Wittgenstein does talk about. I forget. Um, However, I think he likes Wittgenstein a lot because he does say, like, what we cannot say, we must stay silent about, right? What we can't talk about, we have to remain silent. But even
In the
silence is a
Tractatus,
sort
yeah.
of like interruption of the discourse that it touches on the real for Lacan. Like it's the unconscious speaking, right? But failing to. It's the subject speaking. Um, and I think that's why he prefers topology, because he says specifically psychoanalysis as a theory is a discourse without speech. This is why he prefers topology and writing and mathematics and all these formalization or formalisms that we could turn into formalizations, but they ultimately fail. But we could see at the side of the impasse those failures, those gaps, that the subject is tethered or knotted within, right? Its own cause and its own undermining as an effect, right? Um, this is why he likes topological mathematics, and we could see set theory as like a flattening out of that via the signifier, but then he moves on to like knot theory and other forms of topology to map out like the body of jouissance, right? It's like the signifier is like a failed attempt, right, at enjoyment, right? But I'll just say, like, for
Indeed.
Wittgenstein, he kind of gets close because he gets at like this problem of sense and nonsense. But for Lacan, because we're talking about the unconscious as not only the unconscious subject of the signifier, but as, like I said earlier when we were talking about that brief moment of sexuation, the sexual non-rapport, it is absence, right? An absence of sense, and then he plays off of it. Absence of sense, it's absex, right? Absex sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I look, but this is kind of why I read more Lacanians than Lacan per se, because I just the language. I mean, some people find it fun, like all of the little terms he invent. I just get annoyed by that, which is why I like Hegel, because Hegel never invents new terms. He just, always. Anyway, it's a whole other conversation. But no, thanks, Andrew. That was fantastic. Yeah, and as you said, yeah, the bit about cybernetics, but also the Wittgenstein bit in our previous conversation, we touched on that. I'll certainly leave a link to that too. But yeah, anything you want to shout out, man? Like, I think your podcast, the other work you're doing before we
Yeah, like
conclude.
right now I'm doing a lot of work on Seminar 16. I think at our first conversation I had, like, barely started it, but I had it's an ongoing process. I had Samuel McCormick on recently to talk about discourse theory and sexuation and topology, which was a very wonderful conversation. I'm planning on to do a more Marxist segment as well. So there'll be more Marxist stuff as well. I'm doing a return to Freud project, which I'm also trying to set up a Patreon because I want to have specific, popular, but also rigorous essays on there. Because let's face it, and I like the thing that you put in your podcast. Like, what am I selling you? Nothing, But if this work has benefited your life, it's that symbolic exchange that matters, because we're in a
Yeah,
sense
yeah,
working class intellectuals, and we don't get any merit or perks from the university, and so we're working, trying to make a living, and we love to do this on the side as a passion, not even as a hobby, but as a way of life. So, like,
correct.
something,
Yeah,
some crumbs, throw me some crumbs.
yeah,
So that's like, yeah.
yeah. Just so.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
like,
yeah. Yeah, I mean the best
yeah,
gift is a nothing.
yeah,
Yeah,
but like
for
that's
nothing.
what,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
to
yeah.
look forward for. And I'm also doing an offline study group on Seminar One. So if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on Facebook, Instagram, or whatever. And yeah.
100%. Yeah, yeah. I'll leave all the links in the show notes. Weren't you also doing something with Daniel Tutt?
Oh yeah,
Isn't that
yes,
correct?
yeah. So
Or
I'm a
I
part of
think
his.
like a book
Yeah, I'm a
study
part of
or.
his emancipation study group. So yeah.
Oh,
So
great! Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love his
yeah, so right
podcast.
now
It's
we're
great.
doing a
Yeah,
Frederick Jameson course, so I'm a part of that. So if you watch the recording, you'll see me in the Q&A. And then I'm a major participant in the psychoanalytic side. We had just finished Seminar 17. I think the last time we talked, I was doing Seminar 17. And we had just finished that, which that opened my eyes with discourse. So like my main projects, besides like all these exegesis that I'm doing on like on my channel, my solo channel, because the Vanishing Mediators channel, we are concluding seminar 3 and we're going to start on 4 and 5. And the 4 and 5, if you know, have to do with the graph of desire. So that's something that I look forward to being able to like explain for everybody, because of course Lacan's hard, but I have never seen a video yet that could really precisely explain the graph of desire. And so that's going to be one of like my like sort of challenges, my Mount Everest challenges. But other than that, on my solo channel, it's just been Seminar 16 and Return to Freud and some Marxism. So yeah, stay tuned for all that.
Love it. Love it. 100%, man, for sure. I'll keep an eye out. And I'm definitely, when the Patreon, will keep an eye out for that too. But thanks, Andrew. That was great. Much
Oh
appreciated.
yeah, it's a pleasure. Always good to talk to you, man. I hope to talk to you again. Let's keep the conversation rolling.